Hello all, I'm Marina Lostetter, author of the Noumenon series. This is part 3 in my reading series where I read to you parts of my published work and upcoming work. Today is book 3 in the Noumenon series, and book 3 is special because book 3 is coming out August 18th, which may or may not be today, depending on when I feel like posting this. I'm going to post it ahead of time. This is what book 3 looks like outside of North America. This is what book 3 looks like if you are in North America. Unfortunately, at the time of this recording, I do not have my author copies yet. I would like them very much though, so hopefully soon. So I'll be reading out of this book. This is why the book I'm reading from looks a little bit different than the books I was reading out of in the previous videos. Alright. So once again, I'll read you the blurb first, give you a little bit of background info, and of course, this is book 3 in a completed trilogy, so spoiler alert! Left to watch over a planet created by the alien structure known as the Web, the ships of the Noumenon convoy and the artificial intelligence ICC have lain dormant for thousands of years. Now, though, creatures are stirring in the convoy's halls. With seemingly miraculous speed, the planet is coming to life. Where have these beings come from, and why? To understand this new anomaly, ICC reaches out to the descendants of its original crew. Together, they will embark on a stunning journey of discovery, billions of years in the making. Noumenon Ultra is the epic conclusion to one of the most remarkable science fiction series of the 21st century. A wondrous exploration of space and humanity's future. Yes, so Noumenon Ultra. And so the fun thing, too, now that I have all of the books together, I can admit to a joke in the titles. So, book 1 is Noumenon, 2 is Noumenon Infinity, book 3 is Noumenon Ultra, and so this is actually a Noumenon to Infinity and Beyond joke. So, yes. There's a Buzz Lightyear joke in the titles. Thank you. Okay, so context for the portion I'm about to read, which is actually, this time we're just starting off from the very beginning. In book 2, at one point, Convoy 7, which is the Noumenon convoy, splits into two. One half goes to the Web, and the other goes off to explore some alien stuff that they found, you know? So, the beginning of this book takes place on that split-off convoy, and we get to see a little bit of what they saw. Ivan! Ivan! Ivan only vaguely recalled that his name was Ivan. In the dream, his name was a sense of reach, of mental touch by another dreamer. He'd been told his name, the word, the letters, the sounds of it, when he'd first joined the dream. Only a few weeks out of the tank. Cloning take to dreamer, one womb to the next. He'd been studying Atari records just now, while letting an emotive symphony swell through him, reading a book that 2 other dreamers were currently writing and rewriting in real time as he read, and allowing the sensation of soft kittens to travel over his fingers. He liked blue, and all of his world was blue today. But there was that annoying sound again, when he'd heard with his ears, not in the dream. Was today? No, it couldn't be. Not yet. Had his time to be caretaker come already? Why hadn't the current caretaker come to him in the collective? Why hadn't they prepared him in the dream? Ivan! His limbs convulsed. His real limbs. The ones attached to his actual body. Everything tightened. Everything pulled. All his muscles contracted at once. He could sense his skin stretching around the anchor bolts that kept his exoskeleton screwed solidly to his bones. Things twisted. His spine twisted. He wasn't supposed to be able to feel his spine. His eyes opened. Air. He could feel air on his eyeballs, and it was unnatural. It was dark all around. Thank the ships for small favors. But there was a shape right in front of him. Too close. It was blurry and pale. Everything was blurry, he realized. His eyes hadn't tried to focus for years. Taking stock of what he could, he noticed he was standing, his exoskeleton held upright by the hydraulics and wires attached to the tracks in the ceiling. There were other figures nearby, as there should be. Their bodies played out scenes here in meat space, letting their muscles work, their bones and organs experience some level of stress. It helped keep them healthy on the inside, which was all that mattered. Last time he'd had his eyes open, he'd been in a group of other children, their exoskeletons playing a wires and tubing-friendly version of Leapfrog. A group of Autons had settled him into place, their robotic faces blank, but their touch gentle. They were consciously guided by the other dreamers, of course. The crew still had to perform in the real world, and they did it through these extensions. How else could they obtain samples and records when they visited new locations on the Natari map? But all the intellectual work was done in the dream. The Autons had been transferring him into his adult exoskeleton that day. The last exoskeleton he'd ever need. At some point in his life, he'd been transferred out of his first small exoskeleton into his toddler exoskeleton, and then into increasingly larger ones to fit his growing form. He had teetered on the edge of awakeness each time, but had never fully reached it, and he couldn't remember most of the configuration of the crew around him. What mime of a task they'd been performing. Though the dream made memories clearer, he had trouble settling on which memories were his. The dream was collective, the dream was all, and the younger he was when a memory was formed, the more like everyone else's memories it seemed. Ivan wasn't sure how old he was now. Fully grown, though, for certain. He'd been able to do 3 lifetimes worth of professional study so far in the dream. That was why the crew had given up meat space, after all. The dream made so much more possible. Fully grown and fully capable. And now he had to face a responsibility he'd always dreaded. "Ivan!" said the pale shape again. "I think you were supposed to call me Dr. Baraka?" he tried to say. But his mouth had never fully formed words before, and his tongue was underdeveloped and clumsy. "Don't try to speak. Not yet," said the shape. There was a sharp creak as the shape moved. Hands came up to Ivan's face, drew back his lips, looked at his teeth. Not a grinder. Good. "I'm not supposed to be awake yet. Not for another year in real time, at least," Ivan tried to say with his expression. But his face felt stiff, skin too taut. "Why not come to me in the dream first? Why am I awake?" "You're confused," the shape said. Slowly, Ivan's eyes were adjusting. He could see the outline of a face now. He might see more if the person backed up. They were so close his eyes nearly crossed, trying to focus. I see the confusion. But I couldn't inside. Inside, everyone knows all at once. I need just one. One first, then the others." The figure made a gesture with one arm, a movement too fast for the automated system. The person was in full control of their own exoskeleton. They had to be the current caretaker, Hillary and Nekusa. But what she was saying made no sense. Or was it just because Ivan wasn't used to words? Ivan's body lurched. His exoskeleton lifted off the floor, the entire weight of it suspended from the ceiling. The clack, clack, clack of wheels turning over followed him as the system carried him off, through the darkened husk of the ship. Where? He tried to ask, but she was gone, left behind by the pulleys. The wires pulled him higher so that he could fly above the clusters of his crewmates. Those he'd been with had been posed playing a game of some sort. The pieces were non-existent, as it was only the movements that were important, not the items. So it had been impossible to tell which. Now he wound through people casually leaning against a bar as though having drinks at a party. 2 individuals were wrestling. Another group playing some kind of team sport. There, babies! A group of adults, surrounded by the Autons they controlled, held them close. The Autons were in constant motion, seeing to the infant's real-world needs, while the crew members' bodies provided all-important human contact. The darkness allowed his weak eyes to take in shapes and silhouettes, along with minimal definition, without being injured. Nutrients that were typically synthesized via light exposure were pumped through one of the various IVs stuck through his body. But still, everything about this, outside the dream, was alien. In the dream, things were only quiet when you wanted them to be quiet. Everything was brightness, action, socialization, learning, progress. Nothing stilled unless you asked it to. There was no aloneness unless you sought it. And the sense of the dream, vibrant, always pleasant. Here everything smelled of nothing. A constant scent so familiar to his olfactory senses that his nose no longer properly registered the smell. Ivan was fairly sure he'd never experienced true darkness. Not like this. The dream allowed them to rest different parts of their brains at different times, so as long as he was hooked up, he was never truly unconscious. It was a dream, but it was not sleep. He swept up staircases, down hallways, seeing the ship in its totality for the first time. Shambhala's schematics were in the dream, and he'd glanced at them at some point in his early life, but it was a strange abstraction. A map of the galaxy was more meaningful to his mind, had more spatial references to his experienced reality than the map of the ship he'd inhabited his entire life. The track twisted, the wires descended, dropping him heavily in front of a massive window. A real window, not a monitor or a carefully directed reflection. And, for the first time, he felt vertigo. Space. So much space. So much distance. If he leaned forward, he imagined he could fall into it, hanging there in 0G over the bottomless pit of the universe. He felt so large in the dream, so centered, but here he was insignificant. He felt even smaller when a great loop of matter swung into view, and he realized the ships were in orbit around... By the ships, what is that? Before he was born, 7.5 had found several megastructures, including one that they called the Void. It had solid sides and was hollow, in a sort of diametric opposition to the net-like structure of the web, which embraced LQ Pixidus. But this was nothing like either. This was perverse. This was worlds gone wrong. Convoy 7.5 was in orbit around one half of a binary system of planets. Only binary typically described two bodies tethered by gravity, and these two were tethered by something else entirely. It was as though they had been harpooned, skewered together by a violent thrust. A structure at least 2 astronomical units long, if it was indeed a single structure and not many, protruded from both. The smaller planet, the one closer to the system's parent star, trailed a long length of the structure. The construct was as thin as it was long, perhaps a few 100 kilometers in diameter, and it stuck out of one side of the small rocky planet like a thread. That thread passed through the near center of the globe, bursting out the other side before connecting with the larger rocky planet. Here, though, it looped through the land, coiling upwards in great arcs, as though tangled in the planet's innards. Ivan was reminded of the cordyceps fungi, which partially grew in and burst out of insects. That's what this structure looked like. A parasitic abomination. A giant worm speared through the planets, shackling them together. The planets themselves looked dead, with no tectonic activity. Wisps of atmosphere clung to their surfaces, a visible portion winding its way up a protruding bit of structure, where it was either siphoned off by the star or evaporated into the coldness of space. These planets had been killed by this thing. Maybe it's unrelated to our megastructures, he thought. But even as he hoped, he knew better. One of the tallest arcs on the large planet swung beneath the window, and even though the ships were orbiting thousands of kilometers out, there was no mistaking the structural similarities between this long, wormy thread and portions of the web. This seemed to confirm their worst fears, that maybe the web wasn't benevolent or even benign. There had been a war. They knew that already from records recovered at other stops, but this was the first physical evidence they had of a structure interfering with a planet. None of this information had been input into the dream. Without an inter-convoy computer to record things for them, they relied heavily on one person who lived largely outside the dream to act as their reporter. Why hadn't the caretaker shared her initial findings? "Do you see?" came a strained question from the darkness. Ivan tried to turn his head, but his exoskeleton held him rigidly in place. "Planets," he said, tongue stumbling. "Not just comet. See the comet?" And I will stop there. So again, that's Noumenon Ultra, the third in a complete trilogy. So if you haven't started it, you can rest assured that it is done. You're getting the whole story. Again, this is outside of North America, it looks like this. In North America, it looks like this. Thank you once again for listening to me while I read my own work, and I hope you stop by to watch my future videos where I read other published and upcoming work. Thanks again.